This Artificial Intelligence and Equality podcast is hosted by Carnegie Council Senior Fellow Anya Casperson. Together with Wendell Wallach and an international advisory board, they direct the Carnegie Artificial Intelligence and Equality Initiative, AIEI, which seeks to understand the innumerable ways in which AI impacts equality and international affairs. This episode features Carl Miller. It was recorded on August 30th, 2023.
The theme of re-envisioning ethics and empowering ethics for the information age has become highly significant for both the Carnegie Council for Ethics and International Affairs and the AI and Equality Initiative. Central to this exploration is a deeper understanding of the evolving power dynamics, especially those driven by technology and AI. This theme permeates numerous episodes of our podcasts. To delve into this topic more profoundly, we have sought insights from individuals deeply immersed in comprehending the impact of technology and AI on humanity, society, and the environment. Of particular interest is how this evolution reshapes our perception of power and its implications for technology and AI governance. Our distinguished guest today, Carl Miller, stands out as a leader in this arena. I'm truly delighted to welcome him.
Well, gosh, that's very flattering. Hi there, Anya. Hi there, everyone. Thanks so much for having me.
Carl is a pioneering digital researcher and the co-founder of the Center for the Analysis of Social Media at Demos, an independent research organization dedicated to studying the virtual realm. Additionally, he serves as a visiting professor and research fellow at King's College London. His 2018 book, The Death of Gods, offers an insightful analysis of how the internet, social media, technology, and AI are reshaping global and individual power dynamics and historical patterns informing the associations between power and technology. Before delving into the captivating technological issues that have engaged both you and me for years, Carl, I'd like to provide our listeners with a deeper glimpse into your background. What drove your interest in technology, especially from the perspective of warfare, which intriguingly links our two stories?
Doesn't it, Anya? Yes, it does. And yeah, it was my background's a slightly tangled one. It's always slightly challenging to kind of like turn it into a story. But basically, I started my life in the War Studies department at King's, actually looking at warfare as a kind of, you know, as an academic and as a researcher. I was fascinated back then with this kind of flip that had happened in my early career away from conventional wars and over to kind of counterinsurgency conflicts. And kind of my initial jobs were around counterterrorism and counter-radicalization. That back then seemed to be the kind of big challenge that we were all having to face. And that seemed to be all the questions that we needed to have answered. And kind of now we've kind of looped back, haven't we? And as we have, and as the kind of geopolitical arena has become hotter, as state-on-state conflict has become a kind of much more pressing reality again, the kind of intervening years that I spent basically studying social media have kind of rejoined back to power. So nowadays I kind of spend most of my life really trying to understand this strange, murky world of information warfare, about how information has become a kind of strangely a kind of theatre of war. You know, it's kind of joined air, sea, land, and space as this kind of place that warfare happens within. And I've kind of thought for the last 4 or 5 years that that's just had the most utterly profound and important implications for the worlds that we all live in, of course, because it's brought all of us, our ears and our eyes and our minds, to this kind of strange new front, whether we like it or not.
And a few years ago, just building on what you just said, you posited a very compelling notion. Power lets you zero in on how lives are being shaped, who is doing the shaping, and just as importantly, what has become less influential and important than you think it was. I personally find the statement to be profoundly true, talking about, you know, new theaters of warfare, new political discourses, or how we think about technology in general. And I would appreciate if you could expand upon this statement. I believe it holds significant food for thought that could greatly benefit our listeners.
Sure, I'll chomp on this food for thought for a moment, because I think, and thanks for asking this, because I kind of always thought that power is a kind of marvelously useful idea, especially in moments like ours that we're currently living through. I mean, it's also very slippery, you know, and we kind of use it to describe actually a whole array of different things, all the way from kind of coercive power and force through to economic power and incentives, all the way through to like ideational power and the power of persuasion and ideas and arguments. But what power really is, deep down, is the ability to shape the world and therefore our lives in our hands, and in the hands of others, of course, it's the ability to shape our lives in turn. And I started to think seriously about this back in 2017-18 when I was writing my book, and have dwelt on it all the way since then, because I think in moments of great revolutionary change, it's an extremely important kind of idea to turn back to, and we always do. You know, we think about discussions around the kind of commanding heights of the economy and the means of production and who owns it during the kind of, you know, industrial revolution, or think about people debating the authority of the state in the 19th century as the modern state emerged, or think in the 1960s about scholars like Foucault kind of trying to expose the kind of hidden operations of power and language. Each and every time the world changes in a big way, power changes. Who has it, how it's being used, what it's being used to do, what even it looks like, they all reshuffle and redistribute. And focusing on that kind of, and really asking how our lives are being shaped, what those forces look like and what they mean, I think allows us to kind of make sense of moments of revolutionary change. And it's really what I've been doing right now, because I think we're living through one of those moments. I think AI probably is the leading force which has reshuffled everything now. And it kind of seems to me right now that, and this is an irony, I think, in a world so awash with data, with so many algorithms and so much analytics, actually, we're living in a very mysterious moment. You know, I see our horizons actually drawing in. I think our futures are becoming less known, even perhaps less knowable. And so this is exactly the moments, I think, when focusing on an idea like power lets us peer a bit into the future as well, and hopefully make sense of how our lives are being reshaped in that way.
And do you think it's power as a framing to dealing with this uncertainty, to this sort of mysterious future that we're entering into? Do you find that as is a helpful framing, but is it also a framing that is understandable to people? Do you find that people are receptive to this way of looking at it?
Yeah, I think so. And I think that power, when it's in operation at least, is something which is kind of, even in if it takes very weird forms, ultimately something that everyone can recognize. You know, a hacker might use weird forms of power to break into your computer. You know, I remember as part of my journey around the world, and really what I was trying to do, by the way, in all of this was to actually get onto the front lines of power. I don't really think you can simply Google an inquiry like this together. You would need to get out of your room and get out on the road and actually meet the people and go to the places where power's being fought over and won and lost and reshaped and competed for and used. But it might be in strange forms, but you can see it happening to you. Like if you are a hacker, you can feel this new form of power. If you're an open source investigator, you can. If you're someone whose life has been completely shaped in one way or another by AI at the moment, you can. So I do think it brings it back to people. And when you start, say, for instance, focusing on, say, power in the workforce, you actually can use that to connect to the very real immediate concerns that I think so many people have around AI right now, which very practically is like, am I going to have a job in the future? Am I about to get automated? Am I about to have my wages cut? Am I about to be competing against the machine somehow? So yes, I think ultimately it's very, very practical. It might feel abstract in the sense, of course it is, because we can apply it in so many different realms of our lives, but the answers it gives us matter to us all.
Before I move on to a different topic, because I'm going to pick up on one thing you said, because you referred to hackers.
Sure.
And I remember very clearly from your book, you actually have this very interesting statement on it, where you're describing hackers as a new kind of ruling class, if I remember correctly, which I thought was really interesting. And I think you're making a very good point. Can you speak a bit more about that?
Yeah, gosh, well remembered.
Cyber-centric, systems that are highly cyber reliant, etc.
So you go to Las Vegas and you're hanging out at Snackus Maximus in Caesar's Palace, and you're in the dry Nevadan heat. And then all of a sudden, down the road comes this whole new kind of player that suddenly arrives. They've got shock blue mohawks and blockchain tattoos, and they've got code jokes written across like black t-shirts, because kind of once a year, every year, DEF CON comes to town. Kind of tens of thousands of the world's best hackers all descend on Las Vegas for this kind of riotous week, really, where they talk and exchange and compete with each other. And on these glowing stages, the world's best hackers will kind of reveal the year's most fiendishly clever hacks. And on that stage, I saw the most unbelievable things. I saw hackers hack into laptops using light and sound, and light you can't see and sound you can't hear. I saw hackers kind of demonstrate that they could cause wind turbines to burst into flames. All kinds of operations of power, which were both weird and unmistakable at the same time. And I left kind of thinking, they were also a community. They had shared values. Not political values for sure, because there are Nazi hackers and hippie hackers and Putin hackers and Ukraine hackers, and they're kind of divided. Every major conflict has hackers on both sides, but they were united in the relationship they had to technology, and in that way also very, very different from the rest of us. To them, these black boxes that we carry around in our pockets, they're not closed and they're not unknowable and they're not mysterious. They're full of procedures and chips and operations and processes which actually are readable to them and cognizable and therefore manipulable. So they've got a completely different relationship to the world via technology to the rest of us, which I thought was a new source of power. And I thought, yes, the most capable of their number, of this kind of strange community, are like a new ruling elite. They've got very rich, they've got very powerful, and they can do all kinds of things that actually the rest of us can't really do. And that, I think, is actually a kind of really great illustration of a kind of more abstract point I was trying to make, that one of the things that we really need to do at the moment is to track down the realities of power today, even when they're overlooked, or especially when they're overlooked and weird and misunderstood. And there in that community of hackers, I think we have a great example of that.
And if you go a bit beyond the community of hackers, because I think you're right, there is definitely a lot of informal power in having those skills and capabilities in our information-reliant reality right now. Do you think that there is a new type of ruling elite that goes beyond it to share amount of money and data and resources they hold?
Well, I mean, there's one concentration of power, which won't be a surprise to you or any of your listeners here, which is unmistakable. And that's in that small, shallow-bottomed basin in California. And the concentration, not just of money, but of decision-making power and the ability to, and really moral power in a sense, to kind of shape the technologies and therefore our lives from Silicon Valley, is unmistakable. That's not a story that begins or ends with AI, of course. That's a story that kind of goes back all the way to the 40s and the 50s. But it's now being extended with AI too. And what we're seeing is the kind of network powers of the very large internet companies of the early Web 2.0 age now be translated into the kind of leadership of frontier models in AI. I think that's one thing which is already very clear. There's really only that place which is breaking new boundaries and breaking new frontiers when it comes to artificial intelligence development. We can delve into that if you like, because I think there's some very interesting forces at play. But then, wherever you look, and this is, I think, the strange characteristic of our age, you can both see power concentrating and also in a weird way diluting at the same time. And I think that kind of this onrush of both kind of power concentrating and also actually the massive liberatory potential of technology is really the one which I've been convinced by more than anything else. So right alongside, the behemoths, the winner-take-all behemoths of Silicon Valley, you've got someone like Elliot Higgins, who sets up Bellingcat and goes from arguing in the comments page of The Guardian to becoming a kind of icon of open source intelligence and really an example of a whole new form of journalism. Or you've got the digital democrats of Taiwan, people who begin by protesting outside of their parliament, literally locked out of the political process in 2014. And then via the Sunflower Revolution, all these, and they would call themselves civic hackers, I think, coming into power, into government in Taiwan and building a digital democratic process to cast and shape and ultimately create new law. So it's a strange multi-headed beast, this distribution of power, and it's certainly not linear.
Let's dig into a little deeper what you just said about these new power elites. And then we will come back to the Taiwan example, because I understand that you just received a grant to look more deeply into these experiences as well. So if we can start with the sort of new technological elite that holds enormous amounts of power, but without the formal accountability mechanisms.
Yeah, I mean, that's 100% true. I mean, in many ways, like the last 10 years of my life have been spent trying to change that. I mean, try to convince governments that they need to step in and form and bring social media platforms and digital spaces and technologies under properly constituted democratic governance. It's unbelievable how long it's taken for governments to be convinced of that case. And until that's happened, like what we've had is either these companies just discretionarily make judgments themselves as to what they think a corporate risk is or what they think is reputationally too threatening, or in fact to be shaped largely by a single American political constituency, both of which are totally unacceptable when you consider that these are platforms which both actually in some of the decisions they make literally are matters of life and death, and also that they touch the sheer variety of the world in ways which no single polity, no single country should ever manage or should ever shape unilaterally. And that's the story of Web 2.0. Sticking my neck out and being slightly optimistic, I actually think that experience is exactly why we're not about to see it repeated again for AI. Firstly, if you think about it, the kind of social media, however damaging it's been to have that in a kind of wild, ungoverned state, is tame compared to what AI is going to do. You know, AI as a technology is not advertising, it's not even remaking the social world. It's far faster than that. It's going to reshape, so I mean, almost an unimaginable number of things. And I think that
what it means to be human.
What it means to be human, what it means to be a machine, how we talk to each other, how we create, how we connect, how we work. I mean, the mind boggles as to what isn't going to be reshaped by AI. And so, number one, like, governments and politicians recognize that they can't afford to stay out of governance. And number two is that we have now reached a point 12 years too late, but nonetheless we are there where we are actually stepping in and regulating, or at least the European Union is, and the UK with impending legislation, and likely the United States at some point as well. So the whole political environment has changed, and the AI, much like Web 2 now, like, can't go under the radar anymore. So I actually don't think that we're going to see a kind of laissez-faire kind of position from governments. I mean, we're certainly not, because we've already got legislation in China and legislation in the EU and likely in the UK and the US sometime down the road. What we are going to see is something else, which is just this sheer challenge of how you either regulate or legislate or do something else as a government to something as fast-moving as AI. And I think that's going to be the cross-cutting struggle, really, which will define that power dynamic, which, by the way, I would say is by far the most important power dynamic in AI, like whether and how it, as a form of power, is confronted by counterpowers created by governments.
So that's an interesting point you made, Carl. And in your book, which came out a few years ago now, you expressed the view that within the realm of traditional institutions and centers of power, and I quote, technology weakens the very structures and institutions that determine the allocation of power. And in doing so, it undermines the established norms dictating the legitimate exercise of power. I find this concept intriguing and believe it serves a suitable gateway to delve into more of the fundamental thesis that underpins your work. I would like to ask you to expound on this concept, these ideas, and in doing so, maybe also provide us with an even deeper understanding of the history of power and the association with technology over time.
Sure. Well, I became interested, of course, and I think everyone is really in one way or another, about how power is controlled. And the kind of way that I imagined that in my head was that was that wild power is a kind of frothing, writhing thing, in the hands of us all. It can be used to do, well, all the things that human beings always do to each other. We can be wonderful to each other and absolutely horrible. And power is used to do all of that. So one of the things that we as civilizations always try and create is ways to control power. And I kind of imagine that as a kind of bars on the cage of this kind of wild thing. And those bars, they can look different. Of course, laws are the most obvious and most coercive way in which we control power. But norms are super important as well, and professional codes and ethical frameworks and standard rules of practice and a million different things. And all of them form this kind of, civilizational mesh, which basically defines in a kind of slightly woolly way what power can be used to do and what it can't. And I think, when we see big shifts in the terrain of power, either in who has it or what it actually is, it seems to me that it manages to kind of wriggle around those bars in new ways. And that's what I kind of saw coming back from this journey around the world that I took to actually try and understand power, that it was in this kind of wild state. New forms of monopoly that just aren't defined by monopoly law and as such in a new way. Information warfare is a form of warfare that's being fought outside the rules of war. Weirdly, war is a very rule-based activity, of course, but we don't have rules of engagement in information spaces much, completely different to which we have for conventional kinetic conflict. In politics, we've got a digital electioneering, but there really wasn't any rules set around that. And it seemed to me that all kinds of things could be done to kind of try and win elections online that like you weren't allowed to do if you were doing the same thing in an offline analogy. So in all of these different parts of our lives, business and politics and warfare and love and life and all of it, it seemed that that power had taken these kind of wild forms, and really, and I think now with AI even more so. And I think the kind of like the real struggle to me was always never going to be about the technology itself. It was always going to be this kind of squishy human kind of art and science of remaking those bars. How do we recast the norms? How do we create more and better laws? How do we regulate effectively? How do we do all the things to basically put power back in its cage?
Power is one of those concepts that it's depending on who you ask, and especially in political science, you get a slightly different answer, and one of the things that I've been worrying a lot about, and I said this in some of my work, this kind of notion of who decides, who gets to decide. What are you seeing from your end, and where do you see democracy's place be in all of this?
Well, that's a wonderful question. Like who gets to decide? Who gets to decide? And actually, this is a great moment actually for me to talk about a project, and that you kind of alluded to earlier, because we are trying to create, in a way, kind of new ways to create rules and ways that don't rely on specifically elected political leaders, but actually give space for everyone to be involved. This is happening right now, and it's something that anyone listening to this, if they so wish, can get involved in themselves. So the grant is from OpenAI, and the idea is to try and build new ways of setting rules to govern AI. And these have to be fast, they have to be constantly evolving, and they have to include a great number and diverse range of different people in order to be at all meaningful. So what we're trying to do, we've teamed up with VTaiwan, which is the Taiwanese civic hackers that I mentioned earlier. They are probably, I would say anyway, and I'm a super fan of their work, the most successful digital democrats in the world. They have built a process to create a consensus-seeking online debate, and through a kind of mixed reality process, including actually meeting up in real life, gasp, shock, and getting to know each other better, that turns into law. And they have managed to use this to break through extremely incendiary and very polarized issues. The first time they rolled this out was with Uber. And you couldn't, if you remember back to those maybe 2016, 2017, Uber was dividing, there's strikes around the world. There was regulatory action. You have the Uber drivers on one side, you had taxi drivers on the other, you had kind of commuters in between. It was a very, very angry debate. They use a platform, and it's the same one that we're using now, called Polis. And it's kind of marvelously simple in a small engineering tweak that changes everything. You get onto this platform and you're asked questions. So we're going to be asking you questions about AI and governance. But instead of kind of just showing the matters on which people most disagree or get people angriest or get people retweeting the most or anything, it begins to surface statements which are most consensual and give those the most visibility. And what that does is it actually gamifies consensus. So people start trying to craft messages which they don't just think are playing to their home base, but which are actually going to find some level of support amongst other people as well. Now, there's actually very clever technology rumbling under the hood of Polis. What it's actually doing is it's drawing us all into a kind of attitudinal map, so it can see the different tribes that have emerged. And that's how it's really defining consensus. It's not just a sheer number of people, it's people from the different tribes that actually all begin to agree. And it's got a very, very well-proven track record of basically unearthing, I would say, excavating consensuses that are normally hidden by the froth of angry debate. Now, our idea is to get all the different tribes in the AI debate into a single space. You've got your gloomers and your boosters and your doomers and your boomers and AI governance people and your engineers and simply confused, frightened, maybe excited people in the middle, everyone. Get them into this same kind of consensus-seeking environment and see whether we can find hidden consensuses, excavate them, which we can't see at the moment because of the kind of tribalism and the way in which normal social media platforms work. And if we can, that's going to be something which, is fed back into OpenAI, which we will publish and write about, which will use environments like Chatham House's Task Force on AI to try and feed into the kind of policy and governance debates, and really do our best for all the people involved to create meaningful outcomes from that debate. So it's not just a talking shop. We're actually trying to turn that into something which has moral weight, consensus items in and of themselves. That's our promise to them. We'll do our best. And that's then something which will continue to live on. So the idea is recursive public, and that really just means that it's a public which continues to form and shape and hopefully expand.
That's very interesting. And also, we can't have we shouldn't have a conversation about power without talking about large language models,
sure,
generative AI, and the power that these models generate. Do they represent something different to us in terms of power and who gets to hold it and who gets to express it?
Yeah. Well, I mean, so firstly, we're already talking about a kind of pre-GPT age and a post-GPT age. I mean, I think it's unmistakable now that in November, when GPT suddenly rolled out, it was one of the most important moments in the history of AI, really. I think for different reasons, for different people. I think for even the technical experts, the progress was staggering. There have been all kinds of engineers now telling me they really didn't expect to see anything like this in their lifetimes. The progress was definitely non-linear from the past, and also that progress was being made in ways which really benefited a very small number of very large companies. The kind of center of gravity really had shifted away from universities and away from small research outfits, and basically to a very small number of companies that could, the kind of approach is quite brute force as I understand it. So the same approaches as before, but you get just this kind of exponential increase in performance when you throw a very large amount of data at it.
Which is not dissimilar from how we, the history of warfare, when you throw a lot of brute force onto a situation.
Exactly. And, scale has a quality all unto itself. And yeah, indeed. And that's what we saw here. So that it was unmistakable, really, that at the moment, at least, like the new frontiers are being broken by a very small number of companies, OpenAI and Facebook and Claude and Microsoft and Anthropic and Hugging Face and a few others who are able to kind of combine very large amounts of data, compute power, and talent and money. And that means that kind of sharpens, really, it will be totally unacceptable for important moral decisions regarding AI to be made by those companies. I don't think any of us want that, and I actually don't think that they want that either. So kind of everyone's looking in a way for, and that's why I think these grants exist, for a way to make these decisions in a more equitable, broader based way. I don't think, by the way, that's the resolution to the problems created by these companies being so powerful and being so rich. I think that creates all kinds of other problems as well. And actually, one of the things I do worry about is we might see, if the same forces hold true, we might see some kind of agglomerated kind of megacorp emerge, a single organization that has an unassailable advantage in AI. I mean, that's really a possibility that some NLP, natural language processing researchers have flagged to me as being one of their main worries. But I think the idea with this OpenAI grant is really what I would like to do is to connect anyone from the outside whose lives are being touched by this technology with the engineers within the companies that build it, and to try and use this kind of consensus-seeking debate around the rules to govern it as a bridge to kind of bridge together, I think, a whole bunch of different communities that probably feel very mysterious to one another right now. I think it's always been the case that people building disruptive technologies don't have a great idea about how their technologies are being used around the world and what they're actually doing. I think there's case after case of that being the case for social media. Likewise, I think, there's plenty of people that would really benefit from having the internal minds and thinking and processes and challenges of the companies be demystified and made a bit more transparent, and just to make that boundary a bit more porous.
But if the very institutions that we usually trust to exercise that power are being weakened by it, how do we align? Where do you see that alignment happening?
Well, I think the answer to that is both simple and extremely difficult at the same time, and that's to build new institutions. We have to build new and different bars on the cage, and I've always felt that leaning into the new places where power is being used and thinking about how we might rebuild, the institutional fabric to govern that has always been better than simply trying to kind of automatically try and strengthen the institutions that we already have. Great example, the reason that digital democracy, I was first excited by it, was actually because, parliamentary forms of democratic representation weren't really doing it for people anymore. In Taiwan, the thing that precipitated the rise of digital democrats was a perfectly parliamentary crisis in representation. The ruling party had the votes on the floor of parliament to kind of whisk through this trade bill that many feared in Taiwan would draw them closer to China. They had the votes. No one was saying they rigged that election. But so many people felt that they were shut out from that vote. Academics and activists and writers and all kinds of people that had much to fear from being brought closer to China. Likewise, the open source intelligence enthusiasts and citizen journalists. I don't think our reaction to that should naturally simply be, well, how do we strengthen traditional mainstream media organizations? I think that's important, but we also need to create new rules for OSINT people, create new rules for civic societal journalists, rebuild the kind of journalistic code in a way which makes sense to them as well. So institution building. Give me a Royal College for algorithmists. Give me professional codes for technology developers. We need to reach the institutional fabric into these new areas. That's how we're going to get through this.
You engage a lot with policymakers, with parliaments, with governments, on these issues. Do you feel that we have the right people in the right places to be able to grapple with these new realities?
I think we all need to kind of upgrade our understanding of technology, really, and I think that's something incumbent upon all of us. I think it's true that many politicians live in a very, very hostile environment, and that means that there's certain professional backgrounds which allow a politician to survive. And I don't think it's an accident that so many politicians are essentially communications professionals. They're either professional politicians throughout a career, or they've come from a place like journalism or think tanks, because it's exactly those people who can kind of survive in an environment which I think is quite hostile. And that's not politicians' fault, really. That's all of us that create political environments. Saying that, I think there's loads of great politicians who, whilst perhaps aren't kind of engineers or machine learning developers, I don't think that's what you really need to be a representative, because they have civil services and they have secretariats and they're supported by kind of technical advisors. I think the thing that legislators need right now is to be is to consider and to act and to represent.
When policy people come to me for advice, I always ask them to hone in on the most important skill, which is asking good questions. And for some reason, and for some reason with AI, because I think it is very easily dealt with as something quite abstract, something mathematical, people become fearful of it. But this is exactly the moment we should be asking questions.
For sure. And look, I mean, I've got a podcast coming out on AI and power pretty soon. And I'm by no means an engineer of these models. And I would say to everyone that might feel like they don't have anything to say on this because they're not an engineer, the engineers don't know what's going on. Like, if you actually talk to the people that are training these foundational models, the best way it's been described to me is like it's medieval medicine or alchemy. Like, they have some experimental results. They can kind of see things going in and then things happening, but they don't have germ theory. Like, they can't really explain or diagnose what's happening in these models. I'll quote one of them. It's like looking into the mind of an alien. And this is a foundational model developer. So yes. There is not like a technical body of skill at the moment which suddenly clarifies everything and allows us to all see things so clearly. It's all a bit mysterious to everyone. And I think we're all a bit bemused in the middle, and everyone is going to have to bring their own skill sets into this. I mean, I worry for the opposite, really. Not that, I mean, on the one hand, what you say is completely right. And we obviously need engineering and technical expertise in the decisions that are being made on a political level. I would also love a lot more humanities people to be in the decisions being made on the technological level. And I think the real danger to me is a kind of engineering monoculture, full of people that have not ever seriously tried to study human beings or understand human beings, making decisions which have everything to do with human beings. That to me is just as dangerous as politicians not understanding the technology.
I could not agree more. And I think needs to be a lot more investment in that. One interesting question that comes out, because you mentioned, the technology companies, OpenAI, etc. And one of the ways we've been trying to grapple with everything we don't understand about these models is red teaming. I think you referred to it earlier in your comments as well. And do you think, because, red teaming and the results that I've seen from various red teaming exercises, there was one just now at DEF CON, which you mentioned earlier, looking at trying to grapple with some of the uncertainties, coming out of, especially OpenAI's model. Do you think red teaming done correctly can also help us understand the power dynamics underlying the assumptions rather, that underlies these foundational models?
For sure. I mean, there's a role of red teaming, as you say, in DEF CON. I mean, I think unprecedentedly, each of the foundational model developers made their code open and allowed some of the world's best hackers at them to try and see how they could break and manipulate and cause various things to happen on the models. So that as a part of kind of actual cybersecurity testing, super essential. But yeah, also societal red teaming. And to me, like one of the maybe one of the worries is because these models are open right now, like the models aren't, but access to them is. We're both seeing, if you look in the global south, in places like India, you're seeing all kinds of really unbelievable uses of them in the name of access and empowerment. But of course, people are worried that all the bad actors are getting their hands on them as well. And I don't think we have a great sense in the kind of policy and research communities, like what all the bad uses of these models are yet. You hear the same things like deep fakes for disinformation. I can actually, if I was a bad actor and I was seeking to use generative AI to influence people online in bad ways, I can think of some much juicier and I think much more powerful uses of AI than actually just creating some deepfake videos and spamming people with them. So I think that probably as a red teaming exercise is something that we should badly do quite soon.
Well, my understanding is that there are some red teaming exercises on these issues, but most of them are done in-house. And what we've seen so far is that there's certainly been those in the tech world and leaders in the tech world that have kind of come back to government officials or to government-led processes and said, there's nothing to see here. We got it all covered. We can govern ourselves, and policy people would never understand what it is anyway. So just let us govern ourselves.
Yeah, I mean, look, that's always been kind of the problem with trust and safety and integrity kind of being driven by the platforms, by the companies, because there's always a kind of, at the very best, there's always a kind of mixed incentive there where, you do have genuinely amazing people in these tech companies, like that do great work and really truly want to fix these problems or do whatever they can, but that always collides with public affairs and kind of corporate risk and legal, and you never quite know when they emerge, as you say, exactly what is motivating the exercise, and is it something which is actually being deployed primarily to avoid a certain kind of regulation or avoid a certain kind of risk rather than something to actually fix the problem. And look, I mean, I've said this for 10 years now, companies are not the right structures to navigate that kind of mixed incentive. Like we have never expected a company to reconcile those different things internally. It can't happen. Like ultimately they got fiduciary duties and they're going to be driven by corporate growth and survivability above anything else. So yeah, it would be definitely unacceptable for this to be slung over the wall, as a public affairs tactic. Likewise, like as long as the risks are being borne by society and all of us, like they can't be simply things which are done internally in the companies. They have to be things which, a far wider array of people are involved in. But I think, again, sticking my neck out, I think the good news is that I would be utterly astonished if politicians allow that kind of argument to fly right now. This is, I have not spoken to a politician. I recognize I probably speak to the politicians that are most like engaged in these kinds of issues, but I've not spoken to one that thinks that this is something which, the companies can just be allowed to continue with themselves for a while. Now, that doesn't seem to me to be the political weather. I think it's become increasingly apparent to me that governments themselves see the models and the data and the talent as like a new form of like coal and steel industry. It's an absolutely fundamental part of geopolitical advantage. It's something they feel like they need to have. And I think countries that don't have foundational models, that don't have the capacity to build them, are kind of freaking out behind closed doors. And that's the other kind of pressure here on governments, aside from just controlling the tech, right? Like the UK, for one, is absolutely desperate to create a environment which is open to innovation and which is attractive to technology companies to come here. So they're really walking a tightrope, because I think like the UK is exactly the kind of country that could be part of the AI revolution, but also might not be. And that doesn't feel like it's settled yet, but it's certainly not settled that we will be here in London a kind of hub for the most important kind of breakthroughs in AI to happen. Beyond that,
do you think that appetite to be ahead, to be seen as a leader, to be recognized as a leader, could it make us accept risks that otherwise would not have been accepted?
For states, yes. And I think, one of the clear messages I've received is that the threat of overregulation in the eyes of governments is real. I think many technologists said to me that China already isn't a hub of AI innovation for exactly that reason. That all the kind of fire and momentum in Chinese AI has kind of left as it kind of stepped in with a very, very centralized form of regulation and control. And I think regulators worry about that. So yes, I think it's going to be a balancing act. But I think probably in the eyes of states, it will be seen as risks on both sides. So of course, risks around the AI and related technologies being used in ways which are bad, but also the very real risk that you will create an environment which then doesn't allow you to have in your territory the things that you need to have in order to be safe and sound and sure about this being a capacity that you can use. And I can't imagine, for instance, that we're going to see a serious use of frontier models in defense based on companies based entirely somewhere else. That isn't kind of what digital resilience looks like to a state.
What do you think we will see in defense?
I will make a prediction because I like predictions, but I will caveat that I'm, and by no means a kind of defense technology expert or researcher in any way. But I think we will see I think we are an enormous amount of activity now being put into kind of national level AI capabilities that will be used kind of exclusively perhaps by statutory and defense sectors.
Mm. And just before we conclude, I just wanted to ask you, because you mentioned geopolitics, and I know that your research, of course, as we have heard, encompasses all of the world. You're looking at these trends, not just in Europe or the US, but also elsewhere. How is power being looked at, in the different regional contexts? And do you see regional differences, also how the association between technology and maybe AI in particular and power is being grappled with?
Sure. Well, let me go back to India, which is a place that's been very energetic and innovative in actually beginning to use large language models. Firstly, the thing that first strikes you, I think, when you delve into that world is just the sheer uses to this that you just here sitting in London, you just couldn't imagine, and they really are truly liberatory in some cases. You have LLMs being used to kind of translate government services into a whole range of different things, to allow kind of small farmers to kind of navigate kind of labyrinthine Indian government bureaucracies in order to attain certain grants. That's all kind of being done by various chatbots. Also good jobs actually being created to kind of mark up various kinds of data sets to allow these models to increasingly understand non-English data sets and various kinds of dialects specific to countries to places in India and countries in Africa. On the other hand, everyone knows that this kind of power is both close to them. These models are open, but they're also very far away. They know that they're there in Silicon Valley. And I think there's a kind of concern that a repeat of Web 2.0 will see lots of moral decisions being taken by the companies which are shaped by moral worlds and political environments very distant from their own. And I think that's one concern which has been said to me a number of times, actually, that it was very hard for countries outside of America and I think Western Europe to get the social media companies to truly pay attention and make important decisions reflecting their concerns. And that meant really that when they did make decisions, it was very much being molded by the US jurisdiction and US kind of moral precepts. It would be very, very sad if this story goes the same way.
We had a guest earlier in this podcast that spoke about digital colonialism. And this was particularly looking at Southeast Asia and, also to the extent that these language models, because they're becoming quite proprietary, many countries don't have the capabilities or the skill or the money to invest in them. They're becoming more costly by the day to create. And if these language models actually become a tool in this new form of digital colonialism, do you see this in your work as well?
Yeah, I mean, you could call that kind of extension of jurisdiction into other areas of the world a form of colonialism, I think, for sure. And I mean, and in general, yes, I mean, you do see extractive uses of these technologies. You see people being paid allegedly 80 cents an hour to mark up horrifying child abuse material. Again, that's actually not a story that begins with the ends with AI. That's been something which, you know, content moderation has been exploited in that way for a very long time. And you see, you know, ultimately the data and the money, you know, and the control flowing all in one direction. So, and I think that's the moment we're living. I've very rarely spoken to someone who doesn't end their sentence extolling all the liberations by then talking about the many risks. And I also haven't come across people that haven't ended once going through all the risks by actually being super excited by a particular use. You know, it's mysterious and scary and thrilling all in the same moment.
Can we code power responsibly?
No, that these things represent power. They are power. But I think whenever we talk about coding anything, I think this is a real trap. Like when you try and code, you know, empathy, maybe power as well into these models, you know, they feel so lifelike when you talk to them. They feel so human. It's hard to not think that there is some glimmering sentience in there somewhere peering back at you. But really, the way they, you know, the best way of understanding them is they're sophisticated autocomplete. You know, these are models that are much better at sounding intelligent right now than being intelligent. There is no glimmering sentience. There's no understanding of any concepts in there. They're just really, really good at understanding what a human being might say back to you. So you ask if it's sentient, it will say. If you talk about power to it, it will talk very intelligently back to you. But it's not holding these concepts in some kind of computer brain as anything which it's actually trying to understand. Saying that, of course, it's very worthwhile just lastly reflecting on the sheer pace of change, though. And, you know, we are getting close to much more general uses of we already are, you know, with ChatGPT and the others, you know, very general models now, which don't look like the AI of the past. So they're miles away from understanding, but they're also moving many miles an hour at the same moment.
What are the temptations that we should try to avoid, given the power these technologies allows?
We should avoid simply using them in ways which we think are consonant with our own personal ideas of good or bad. And that this goes back to wild power. So, you know, seeing liberations and oppressions around the world, you know, you can see how often things which appear extremely oppressive and restrictive and extractive and exploitative to others, in the hands of the people doing it, seemed fine. Like they didn't, you know, very few people in this world think they're the bad guys. And I think that's always a danger with wild power. In each of our hands, we can kind of use it with very little penalty or control in ways that we wish. But actually, that's really quite a bad thing. And the whole reason of actually creating bars is that they're common bars. So common laws, common norms, common understandings. Right now, I think the temptation with AI is just to go ahead and use it in the ways that we think are right. But I think at least until we have managed to drag new institutions into being, to bootstrap new projects, to create new processes, workflows, even new norms at some point, I'm sure as well. We should try and widen our own moral world a bit to kind of think about how the uses of all this tech is going to seem and appear and sound and feel like where in the you know, as it touches the lives of other people. And obviously moral world is very different from our own.
And has your view since the publishing of your book changed? Are democracies currently resilient and strong enough to do this?
I'm actually not part of the school of the democracies are all about to end. I've never kind of felt that. I've always felt that democracies are somewhat more resilient. However alive we have to be, obviously, to various kinds of very worrying forces chipping away at them. But yeah, I do think democracies and states are powerful enough. I've always felt the states were powerful enough. You know, I remember back in the early days of the Web 2 debate and social media debate, MPs would tell me, what can we possibly do to control, companies the size of Facebook? And I would say, you wield the power of a coercive state. States have armies. They have coercive taxation powers. They control courts. Companies are only companies. And actually, in the great hierarchy of power, they are nothing compared to a state. And I think that will be the case now. I think we have like the state has the power to really control these things. And I think ultimately it will. And ultimately, the good news right now, of course, is also that the open economies and open societies have attracted the talent and the capital and the innovation and the energy to mean that it is a democracies where these models have been built. It is a democracies that control them, and we will, I think all indications are, remain in leadership positions, so this.
But is there risk in what you're proposing that we actually then fostering surveillance states as a means to counter the power that these companies hold?
Well, there's risks, and I think in every response to every problem, for sure. I mean, look, the only way through this is by positively re-articulating what we think liberal democratic frameworks are, in worlds greatly changed by things like AI, and then going out there and bootstrapping and creating them. I definitely don't advocate for one moment we start surrendering basic principles, including obviously principles of balanced powers and principles of privacy and principles of private lives to suddenly start confronting these new form of powers. No, we need to be remembering the things that make liberal democracies what they are, and reimagining what they might look like.
And lastly, what instills hope and inspiration in you for the future with all your work on power, new power dynamics, technology, its promise and perils?
If anything, it's actually kind of looking somewhat in the past, if I'm honest. I remember at the end of the podcast that is about to be out, which I've already done, I kind of, there's a moment where I kind of reflect on the moment we're living through, and I actually think this kind of onrush of both thrilling potential and lurking threat probably felt very similar to people living through their own revolutions. I can't think that this was anything unrecognizable to someone living through the Industrial Revolution, or someone living through World War I, or someone living through the Agrarian Revolution, or actually a ton of other moments when the world has changed in quite convulsive ways. And yet, we manage, and there are growing pains for sure, and often damage and often tragedies, but we tend to come through these things okay as the human race. We tend to be able to manage them. And actually, we're right. We're only in the months now of the post-GPT age, and already, I mean, look at the enormous amount of activity, all the amazing thinkers and thoughts and passion that's being poured into the debate that we've just had. We live, in a world very, very different from the early days of social media. There's all kinds of very powerful institutions, very clever people now dealing with this problem, and that all of that makes me actually very optimistic. I think with all the things that we see happening, I think that inevitably we're going to bring these things under some form of control. It will be a constantly movable feast. We'll constantly have to kind of deal with new problems as they emerge, but I think we'll get on top of this.
What better way to end this great conversation on that positive note?
Thanks very much, Anya, and thanks everyone for listening. Everyone that got through to the end. It's been fascinating. I always enjoy a good chat about power.
So, Carl, this has been an incredibly intriguing conversation. I extend my heartfelt gratitude for generously sharing your time, profound insights, and expertise. To our listeners, thank you for tuning in, and a special thanks to the dedicated team at the Carnegie Council for their efforts in hosting and producing this podcast. For the latest content on ethics and international affairs, I encourage you to connect with us on social media at Carnegie Council. I'm Anya Kaspersen, and I sincerely hope that we have proven ourselves worthy of your time. Thank you.